The first key question that really needs to be asked is how the Western countries got to such debt. And it's quite simply this. From the 1990s, after the internet bomb and after the equities bomb, there seemed to be a collective decision that was made, particularly in the United States, but also in places like Spain, Ireland, even to the UK, that given the fact that wages weren't growing, and given that the thing that drove the economic miracle in the United States in the 1990s, the high-tech internet bubble, had burst, that the way the consumer economies were going to be driven was going to be through consumer debt. And this consumer debt, in the absence of increasing wages, was going to be underpinned by housing value prices. And there was an assumption that this was something secure. It was a kind of an effort of trying to make smart money had failed, it was assumed, so we're going to go to the dumb money. Real estate is kind of the most mindless way in which investments can be managed. If properties are going up in an area, you buy a property, your property will go up. This led to the banks. Interest rates were kept extremely low through the first decade of the 20th century, particularly in the United States, where you had positive economic growth, and yet interest rates were maintained very, very low, and a huge housing bubble expanded. This housing bubble meant that there were a lot of loans made that were not sound. But this, through process of derivatives, could be broken up and resold on and resold on and resold on. This actual idea of reselling on was embraced by Greenspan as a way of controlling or spreading the debt out. What it did, though, is it spread the risk out. The United States of America is a very poor place to have a long-term property boom because it's essentially empty. And basic free market forces will kick in. More people were building more and more houses, and at some point the system was going to collapse. There's too much bad debt out there, and the value of a particular house couldn't continue to go up in a country where there are vast areas of farmland, empty land, urban areas have been blighted and can be revitalized. There was always a potential for more property to come on the market. It was only a matter of time before the American system collapsed. And yet banks were doing this, and the question is how much of this was to do with the ethiclessness of the bankers, how much was this due to deregulation, how much of this was also due to the fact that the internet made it possible for quantitative analysis programs, very complicated derivative instruments, to spread the debt out to people who didn't know that they had it. Once the collapse happened, basically the entire economic stability of Western societies was undercut, and all governments, regardless of their ideological stance, took the only step they could. They made public the debt that the banks had taken on. They may not hold that debt permanently public, but for the time being, they bailed the banks out. They bought massive amounts of interest in the bank, and they pumped huge amounts of public money into the system in the hope of keeping the system going. And it has to be said that it has essentially been successful. The United States of America had a collapse on its hands on the scale of the 1929 collapse, and yet unemployment figures, official unemployment figures, remain under 10%. Hardship for a lot of people, but nothing compared to what was being faced. Once the dust settled, once it was clear that the global economic system would be stabilized, and particularly once China and India and the developing world started kicking in and providing enough growth that the global economies could go, there was this issue remaining of the debt, which we all knew in 2008 would probably be a long-term issue. This debt, though, created a very simple narrative in sort of the fantasy structures that undermine right-wing politics. The fantasy became that was the debt itself was harming the economy, rather than the debt being the symptom. So the symptom became fantasized as the cause, and this played into an ongoing narrative about debt, that government spending, government waste was producing a generations after generations of do-nothings who were just living easy lives off the government. This was kind of a populist appeal that the right wing could make. In the past few years, we've seen that the governments that were forced to take on this debt have had to face these kind of populist revolts on the situation of the debt. These populist revolts, though, are fundamentally based upon an entire fantasy situation, that it was somehow actually the indebtedness of average ordinary people, that people were living too high off the horse, which is in part true. People were borrowing too much money, particularly in the United States, which was driving the banking up. But the problem financial was predominantly in the banking structure. But the fantasy that it is individuals and individual debt driving it rather than the bank situation takes away the focus from the banking structure. We're hearing so much less now about the idea of regulating the bank or regulating internet-enabled trading or derivative trading. We're seeing very, very little reform in this very area. Governments now, you're seeing the Tory government, you're seeing the rise of the Tea Party in the United States. They're now playing out this, milking this fantasy that the debt has to be reduced. The debt has to be reduced as a sort of mantra. Debt reduction, though, is something that conservative governments generally are very, very bad at. Particularly in the United States, they're terrible at it. Reagan, both Bushes were noteworthy for rises in the debts. You can only see Clinton and Carter were the last two presidents actually saw debt reduction. There's also debt reduction under Eisenhower. But it was when Reagan came in with this kind of fantasy about the government having to be slashed that we actually saw the debt increase. And this is in part because the entire worldview they had about how debt works, about how government's money is spent, how government impacts the economy, was a sheer fantasy. In the case of Reagan, the fantasy completely fell apart. He comes out of it with introducing massive deficits, many order times larger than what he inherited. Even during a time of economic prosperity, the deficit continued to explode under Reagan and Bush. And once Bush Jr. came along, it went right back up, exploding up and higher and higher and higher again. The thing, though, that once this is being carried out, what we're seeing now in the UK, this policy is being carried out, the first area is to try to impose or seek cuts at an area in which there are people who are so disparate, so politically unorganized, long-term unemployed, that they can't fight back. The issue on that, though, is these people have already been pretty much milked for what they're worth. I mean, these people are living as a permanent impoverished underclass. What was confusing why it was particularly done is that the Tory party in the UK decided to target specifically students. People going to university were identified as these lackers who needed to pay up their full share. At the end of the day, when all the numbers were done, it came out to the majority of students in the UK coming out with £40,000 worth of debt. What we've seen in this recent protests is £40,000 in debt before you've even started your adult professional life is a nightmare. And if carried out, which I certainly hope it isn't, but if carried out, it would have striking economic impact. It would make it very, very difficult for working class or lower middle class kids to attend university. It would also disincentivize people from taking disciplines or areas that may not actually have immediate short-term economic gain. Well, also, by bringing students out with £40,000 of debt, it would be a massive disincentive for the very class that's needed to produce economic growth. Young entrepreneurs, recent college graduates will not be as likely to want to start a new business, which is a highly risky venture with £40,000. So it's really just a fantasy. The economic and what we're seeing now is the economic reality is coming and hitting home.